Welcome to the Family Tree Magazine podcast. This is the show from America's #1 genealogy magazine. I'm Lisa Louise Cook. Death-related family heirlooms may seem a little bit macabre by today's standards, but they may actually hold details that are valuable to your genealogy research. Here to tell us what to look for and what these items can tell us about our family is Robbie Gorr. He's the author of the article Memento Mori, and it appears in the September-October issue of Family Tree Magazine. Hi, Robbie. Welcome back to the show.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks for having me back again.
Well, you're at it again. You're writing such fascinating articles about things that may not be on our radar, but should, because they might actually be in our closets or our attics. We're talking about death-related memorabilia. What kinds of things fall in that category?
There's a lot of things. Some things come to mind immediately, like the post-mortem and funeral photography. But some other things that we might find them not give immediate recognition to, like funeral cards or the guest book from some funeral services, coffin plates that were attached to the coffin and later removed, as well as hair wreaths and jewelry made from hair, and a number of other things that you might come across while looking through all those bits and pieces the family has stored away.
You know, I have to admit, I have never come across a coffin plate, and I was looking at that in your article. Give us a sense. How big are these things? In the pictures, it almost looks like a big serving tray. Is it that big?
No, they're not. They're probably about 6 inches to 8 inches in length by about 3 to 4 inches high. Something that could easily be attached usually to the top of a coffin, but sometimes to the head or foot of the coffin as well.
How interesting. So they actually removed it before they buried the person.
Yes, it seemed to be a tradition to do that, and those coffin plates would often then be displayed in the home on a stand that could be placed on a mantelpiece or on a table, and sometimes they were even framed as well.
Oh gosh, I could imagine somebody thinking, oh, I thought I had this little ashtray, but that's not what this is. Isn't that interesting?
And they're often engraved as well, which helps provide some of the interest for genealogists, because they could contain information such as the name, the date of death, and the age. But sometimes they just had simple endearments like our darling or baby. And they were made from different kinds of soft and easily engravable metal, like lead or pewter, tin, copper, brass, or even silver, all depending, of course, on the expense involved.
Right. Now, I love going to antique stores, and I have come across multiple times like a framed piece of artwork that was made out of somebody's hair. And you mentioned here hair wreaths and jewelry. Tell folks about what these are and what we're looking for.
Sure. Well, people in the Victorian age especially often exchanged locks of hair as tokens of friendship and personal connection and love. And these could be braided and placed in a locket or even wrapped around thin wire, which could be then bent into a variety of shapes to create some interesting patterns and shapes. The use of hair, animal and human alike, was not unknown. It was often used as the stuffing for furniture cushions, pillows, pin cushions. But it was during the Victorian era that hairwork crafts really became a form of artwork. Books were even published about how to create some of these items. And not only could they be created into flowers and wreaths that could be displayed and mounted, they could even be made into items of jewelry, bracelets, brooches, necklaces, and could be placed even into everyday objects such as a watch cover or a pocket mirror and carried as keepsakes.
Yeah. Well, I think about hair receivers. I think people would save the hair out of their combs and things. They were so frugal. And I know some women even made their own hair pieces from their own hair. But folks listening may have an item in their house that they don't even realize is made out of hair. Some of these, and you have photographs of them in the article, are so intricate and you just wouldn't guess off the bat that they're made of hair. I imagine one of the most common questions that you get is, oh, can we test the DNA from the hair? Tell us about that. Can we do that?
Well, in the past, it was not possible to do that because the DNA material required for genetic testing had to come from the root material of the hair.
Right.
And the hair roots were not often present in most of those hair samples, as they were usually taken from the ends of the hair, far from the root base.
Mm-hmm.
But there have been some very recent developments in science that now allow genetic material to be removed from a section of the hair shaft, which means that family hair that's preserved in whatever form can soon be used for identification and genetic profiling of some of our more distant departed ancestors.
Wow, secrets held within these little hairs and these items. It's amazing. Now, another item that you mentioned in the article that I think has kind of much more obvious genealogical information in it would be mourning cards, memorial cards. What kinds of information might help us with our family tree that come from those?
Well, those are just a few examples of the different types of funeral cards that were used over the Victorian era. Some of the original cards were intended as a form of notification of a death, with details of the funeral service and the burial that could be sent to family and friends as a sort of invitation to those final sacraments and ceremonies. After the event, memorial cards could often be created and sent out to family and friends who were too distant to attend or not invited to the funeral itself. And those kinds of cards frequently include more personal information such as birth and death dates and places, and occasionally surviving family members are mentioned as well. Some of the funeral cards originally were quite large so that they could be kept and displayed afterwards, but they quickly became standardized down to about 3 or 4 or even 4.5 inches in length, usually one piece, but sometimes able to open into two. They were printed on various thicknesses of cardstock paper, again, dependent on the expense. And often there was a thick black border around the card that was the standard indicator of the mourning tradition. If you were a Roman Catholic, then Mass cards could be produced with some of the same information that were then kept as reminders and keepsakes of the continuing mourning rituals for their loved ones. And funeral cards were often very elaborately decorated, which makes them an exciting thing to collect and to keep and display. Different kinds of pictures, as well as poems and scripture verses, inspirational sayings, even anecdotes about the deceased may all be included on those types of funeral cards.
Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this. Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com. Break down genealogy brick walls with a subscription to the largest online newspaper archive. Did you know newspapers.com has over 1 billion pages of digitized newspapers dating back to 1690? Their growing collection includes papers from the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Discover birth and marriage announcements, obituaries, and everyday stories about your ancestors in seconds. Newspapers.com can help you fill the gaps between vital records and reveal details about your ancestors' lives that you can't find anywhere else. Their easy-to-use search feature lets you filter your results by date, location, specific paper, and more. And when you find something interesting, newspapers.com makes it a snap to share it with your family and friends. You can even save it directly to your ancestry tree. Come explore 1 billion pages and make infinite discoveries today on newspapers.com. Use promo code FamilyTreeMagazine for a 20% discount on your subscription. That's promo code FamilyTreeMagazine at newspapers.com. And now back to our conversation with Robbie Gorr. Another item I think people probably are more familiar with, they may or may not have one in their own collection, is post-mortem funeral photography. And it seems so odd to us now, but people often not just took a photograph of a deceased person, but you have one image in the article where it looks like the woman is holding her deceased child in a studio. Tell us about that, and how do we know if the person is deceased in some of these pictures?
Well, postmortem photography dates right back to the discovery of photography at the beginning of the Victorian age, and sort of grew and developed as its own industry throughout that era as the traditions and rituals surrounding death became more elaborate. If you do come across a photograph that you suspect could be a postmortem photograph, it's probably one of the very last photographs that was ever taken of the subject, and possibly the only photograph that may have been taken. Because it was such a new invention, not everyone had their photographs taken immediately. And for children especially who may have died young or unexpectedly, they may have had no photograph taken until this photograph was taken at the time of death.
Right.
For Victorians, it wasn't the kind of morbid or macabre event that we now look back on it from our perspective of our modern aesthetics. But it was a way to capture and preserve the memories of their loved ones and lost relatives in a way to help them cope with their loss and the resulting grief by having that lasting visual memorial. And pictures of the recently deceased were often prominently displayed in homes and proudly sent to friends and relatives. And again, could, like hair samples, be worn inside lockets or brooch pins or inset into watch covers and pocket mirrors so that they could be carried daily and looked at frequently. It's easy to spot postmortem photography because they sometimes resemble sleeping pose rather than a wakeful pose, such as the picture in the magazine. But there are studio photographs that are also taken where the body has been posed with eyes open and made to look as though it were still alive and participating in regular daily activities. It was a choice that people could make of their photographer at the time of the death as to the style they wished to have.
Right. I was going to ask you initially about what was the fascination of people back in the 19th century with some of these things, but you've really kind of unveiled that as you've been describing these items. And that is, it was such a different time. people didn't have a million photos on their phone of their loved one, and that last photograph might be the only one that they have. What other kinds of thoughts do you have about what drove the creation of some of these items back in the 19th century and Victorian times?
Sure. Well, these items are generally known today as Memento Mori, and that's a Latin phrase that sort of translates to "don't forget that you have to die." And it
Oh,
goes all the way back to classical times, but not in a negative way. It was more of a positive reinforcement to make sure that you're remembering that you are mortal and that death is certain for all of us. And it was a philosophy intended to motivate and inspire your remaining days of life for the salvation of your soul. And of course, in Victorian times, this preoccupation with the inevitability of death sort of reached its peak of popularity in the elaborate rituals and traditions surrounding death that developed and were practiced at all levels of society, becoming almost an integral part of daily life. Mourning rituals could last for a year or two following the death of a close relative. And so all these objects connected to the death and the mourning, the grief process, have all generally been lumped under this heading now of Memento Mori items. And of course, when these things sort of fell out of fashion with the advent of the 20th century, family found that they were reluctant to throw these items away. They were family related and connected. And so that's how they often found their way into storage, along with unused furniture and old trunks of clothes, and stored in attics and basements, closets, storerooms, even outbuildings, wherever the family would put the trappings of past lifetimes that were no longer wanted or used, but just couldn't be thrown away. So that's where you need to look in order to see if you have any of these unusual treasures.
as the memorial card says in your article, it says "gone but not forgotten," and of course, that's a lot of what we're doing as genealogists. Is we're, in a way, resurrecting the memory of many people who may have been forgotten over the generations and bringing them back into the tree. And these items can help us do that.
Yes,
Robbie,
and telling their story as well.
yes, absolutely. Robbie, how'd you get interested in all these death-related items?
Well, it starts with my interest in genealogy.
Yeah.
When I was about 13 years old, I was just fascinated with the attic at my grandmother's farm. It was a curved staircase that went up off the kitchen, and they used the attic area above as a storeroom. And it was just a thrill to be able to climb those curved stairs and to poke around in the dust at all the objects that were stored up there. And I can remember dragging things so excitedly down into the kitchen. My grandmother's old German family Bible was an item I was particularly interested to find. The pages for family entries had not been filled in, but there were many documents and papers tucked between the pages of the Bible. One of them had a listing from the local church about my great-grandparents' marriage, and then a list of all their children. And their oldest was my grandfather, and it was all written in German. And it was the very first time I'd seen his name other than the English version of it. On the tombstone, his name was always Henry F.W. Gorr, but in this document, there was his name in full in German, Heinrich Friedrich Wilhelm Gorr. And it first gave me my sense of cultural heritage and identity. And of course, in the attic, I was finding all kinds of things: post-mortem photos, coffin plates, funeral cards. So it was a real experience for me at 13 to find those things, and I've just never seemed to have lost the enthusiasm for those kinds of things over the years.
Oh, very understandable. What a great story. Any other items that you didn't get a chance to get into the article that you think we should keep an eye out for?
Sure, there are lots of different items of Memento Mori. Not all of them have the same genealogical value, but are nonetheless valuable for their family history connections. One thing that might be found are mourning embroideries. These were the kind of embroideries done by the ladies of the household, usually with some kind of a picture, an urn, a weeping willow tree, and some kind of a motto, sweet rest in heaven, or we mourn our loss. They don't often have a particular name or a date of the person who may have passed and inspired such a creation. But nonetheless, these embroideries were framed and often hung in the home. And so it's very interesting to come across them and try and date them and figure out who may have created them. And in the same way, you might also find mourning handkerchiefs or fans among some of the items of clothing that have been saved. Those were items that were either black in color or were bordered in black, specifically made or created for the period of mourning that the family was going through. And as well, there's other kinds of mourning ephemera that might be found, different kinds of stationery, including paper and envelopes that are usually black-edged. I found amongst my family's collection a letter that had been sent to my grandparents informing them of the death of my grandfather's cousin, and the envelope and the paper both had a black border. I can only imagine receiving an envelope in the mail with the black border on it and knowing with certainty that that was not good news that was arriving.
Right.
People also used calling cards when they visited socially, and special calling cards could be created if you were in mourning that would have the same black border around the edge, or perhaps just a few black lines around the edge if you were further along in the mourning process. Also, there are business cards, newspaper advertisements that you can find for services related to the funeral industry, for the undertaker or the tombstone maker, or even the stores that sold clothing and items, the printers who created the calling cards and the funeral cards. Just their business advertisements and cards are linked to this whole Memento Mori industry.
Wow, it's fascinating. There's so much everybody listening will be able to go out and search for and hopefully gain a little bit more insight into their family. I encourage everybody listening to check out Robbie's article. It's Memento Mori. It's in the September-October 2024 issue of Family Tree Magazine. Always fun to talk to you. Thank you so much, Robbie, for coming by the podcast.
Good. It was fun to get to talk about one of my favorite subjects again. And I want to encourage all your listeners to go out and have a look. See if you can find your cache of family relics. They have great value to your family history and to your genealogical research as well. And don't throw them away.
Exactly. Thank you. Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Family Tree Magazine podcast. This is the show from America's #1 genealogy magazine. I'll have links to everything that we've talked about today on the show over at the show notes page, and you can find that at familytreemagazine.com/podcast. And there you'll also find a huge back catalog of past episodes full of topics that are going to help you in your genealogy research. And when you stop by the website, be sure to sign up for our free newsletter. That really is the perfect way to stay in touch with Family Tree Magazine and get all the latest and greatest news, plus the announcements of each and every new podcast episode. I'm Lisa Louise Cook, and I hope that you'll come by and visit me at my website, genealogygems.com. And there you will find the Genealogy Gems podcast and a link over to our Genealogy Gems YouTube channel. So until next time, have fun climbing your family tree.